This is the third in a trilogy of stories, begun by the Quirk Road and preceded by the horror of the Quirk Wood. If you haven't listened to these stories, you may want to prior to listening to this one. The forest through the trees. February 5th, 2021. After some big crypto returns last year, I ended up well off enough that I felt comfortable buying a large plot of land just east of Stanton, Kentucky, along with a small trailer to sit on it. The property rests off a one-lane gravel road, some 200 acres of wooded mountains and babbling brooks, replete with all the game and space I could ever ask for. It's exactly the kind of place I've needed, I think. A forested reprieve from the unhinged back and forth of the wider world. Now that I've gotten myself moved in, I'll probably relax for a few months before going back to work. I want to get my garden set up and begin some projects around the property, as well as dip back into my writing. It should be a calming breath of fresh air after years of uncertainty. I need to wash the wear and tear of the last half-decade off before I dive headfirst into normal day-to-day worries again. I've decided to record little progress reports as I go, just to listen through it someday. Hopefully smile at how far I've come. Other than straightening out the inside of the trailer today, there's not much to report. I've organized my small library in the second bedroom as a sort of study, and I've cobbled together a couple composting bins at the wood line to start up as the weather gets warmer. There's about half an acre or so of mowed lawn around the trailer that I'll fence in for chickens this spring, and a nicely made wooden outbuilding in the trees which I'm thinking of converting into a cabin for guests to make use of. Maybe I could rent it out as a nightly, given how close I am to Red River Gorge out here. Regardless, all that's a ways off down the road. For now, I'm content just walking the woods out back. The plot is roughly in the shape of a triangle, with the trailer in the center of one edge. It cuts across a valley, and the land slopes down sharply through the woods before rising up again when you reach the far point of the triangle, where the property ends. There's an overgrown old ATV trail that skirts one edge of the property, and I've started beating down a footpath which loops along the other side. By next week, I'm hoping to have a nice jogging route carved out back there, with stepping stones fording the creeks that carve through the valley floor. It's all very rough terrain. I'm ecstatic at how untouched it all seems to be. There's plenty of deer shit along the lowland creek banks and tracks in the mud to match it. Hopefully it'll make for good hunting this fall. February 12th, 2021. I've spent my first week planting some trees along the gravel road. Once they are grown, the trailer will be hemmed in. It's not like there's much traffic up here. The house way down at the end of the lane is an old rental cabin which sits empty, and the neighbor near the main road is a hermit who I've yet to see leave the shack he keeps back in the trees. Still, I look forward to having a bit more of a privacy barrier, even if there's no strict need for it. I bought some cheap lumber and built up 6 raised garden beds as well. There's so many rabbits in the woods that I need to build them high, just to make sure I don't lose crops to them. I figure I make enough noise around the house that I shouldn't have to worry about deer getting into them, but even if they're bold, I'll have the fence up before long. Hopefully the activity and the shitty obstacle combined will keep them away. I'm starting to fill up the compost bins near the wood line, but it'll be a long while before that's ready. For this season, some glamorous bagged compost from Tractor Supply and a bit of peat moss will have to do padding the beds out for planting. I still haven't gotten around to cutting a jogging trail, but I have done a bit more wandering. The two little creeks along the valley on the property cut pretty steep gashes through the hills near the property lines. There's even a little waterfall downstream from where I usually cross, when the two merge together and the force of the stream picks up. I've been doing a lot of reading down there in the afternoons, letting the babble of the creeks wash a bit of the worry off. All in all, I couldn't be more satisfied with the place. It's even more of a paradise than I'd imagined. I can pass the day happy, hard at work, and look up to realize it's sundown without a clue as to how the time slipped by so quickly. Every new sapling in the ground or page turned sitting quietly along the creek bed feels equally productive, and I can fast forget the clamor beyond these hills. It's an odd, contented feeling, like I've been let loose from a prison cell without ever having seen the bars before. It's a hard thing to describe, but when I had roommates, whether in college or afterwards, there was always an unspoken sort of stifling going on. I could focus or disappear into my thoughts for a few hours at most before someone poked their head in to coordinate dinner or a friend dropped by and I was dragged along into one plan or another. Here I can wander, and that wandering goes far deeper than just walking around the woods. I can get lost in thought for a whole day, even as I wear blisters into my palms with the haft of a shovel. I genuinely believe I've worked through more thinking and absorbed more text reading in the past week than I did the whole year prior, and I sleep easier than ever when I finally collapse in bed at the day's end. If I'd known what I was missing, I'd have moved mountains to get here ages ago. That's enough prattling for today, though. I should be getting some cement mix up tomorrow, and I'll use it to lay out the posts for my fence, which has been sitting disassembled in the outbuilding begging to get put up for days. After that, I'll start looking into building the coop. February 15th, 2021. The fence is up now. Took the entire weekend to push through it. It's been the hardest thing to get done thus far. Digging all the post holes by hand was brutal, even with the cold weather to keep me cool. That makes it all the more satisfying to see it finished. There was a pretty large ice storm here near the end of the week, but I had the post hole spots covered over, so it didn't end up making the process much worse. I got a bit wet digging in the snow that came afterwards, but at least my area isn't suffering any power outages, so things around the house are still in working order. With the work done, I've been able to wander the woods while they're still frozen over and blanketed with a bit of snow. There's a sort of hyper-clarity that comes into a forest when it snows. The brush gets pinned down, and the trees stand out like ink-black pin strokes against the white gleam of winter. The branches that do poke through are coated in ice from the sleet. It gives them a surreal look, like they've been entombed in glass. It was interesting to see how many tracks there were down between the creeks. I'm no expert, but I'd guess at everything from coyote to groundhogs. The deer are particularly active. They must use the creek beds along the valley pretty regularly. Dozens of them, if the prints are any indication. Everything was quiet by noon when I got down there, though, all except for the half-frozen stream. It made for an interesting hike. The ice and snow helped me notice something on the far side of the valley as well. There's a sort of outcrop of rock right at the edge of the property, just below the cusp of the ridgeline. The little stakes marking the boundaries sit right above it, and I don't know that I'd ever walked right past it on the slope until earlier today. It's so thick with briars and scrub that I've never really had cause to pass that way before. But the contrast of the snow made me think there was something up there, and I turned out to be right. There's a kind of carving on the natural ledge, sort of totem pole shaped, if that makes sense. About 8 feet high with a little snouted head at the top. It seems really old, worn down and rough. The features aren't very detailed anymore, and the carven writing, if that's what the weird little symbols are, is almost faded away. There's a layer of ice which is set in over it, which doesn't exactly make things any clearer. I'll bet it's some sculpture experiment someone was playing out using the soft limestone up here, but it'd be fascinating if it ended up being some kind of native Shawnee holdover of one kind or another. I snapped a few pictures of it, so I can try and dig up some information tonight. A very cool find. Now that the fence is finished, I'll get rested up. With the mowed part of the land pinned in, I'll get my dog moved out to the house in the next few days. He's been staying with my brother, but I'll be glad to have the company up on the mountain. The fence is, first and foremost, a minor speed bump for the deer, but it'll also help keep my nosy canine off the chicken coop once I have that out back to piss him off. It'll be more than enough to worry about foxes and coyotes. I certainly don't need my own dog trying to get to them. February 16th, 2021. I guess I spoke too soon about dodging the worst of the ice. We only had a little sleet and snow come down last night, but it must have been just enough to knock a tree down onto lines or collapse something important, because my power was out this morning. Most of the county seems to be out of power, as far as I can gather nosing around on social media. I guess I'll have to keep bundled up in here for the next few days while the heat is off and hope the pipes don't burst before things get back to normal. I've got plenty of flashlight batteries, a few candles, and more than enough to read, so it's no big deal, I guess. I'll try and work out a plan for the chicken coop frame now that I've got nothing better to do. I won't have the lumber for a while, but just plotting it out on paper will keep me occupied. I haven't seen any collapsed trees in the woods, but I've been careful not to sit under any sagging branches when I'm reading out back. Wouldn't want to get my head caved in by a tree limb. On the sculpture front, I haven't really turned anything up. My little sweep online last night seemed to confirm it shouldn't be native, since there's no record of the local Shawnee ever working in stone like that beyond using it for tools. I'll probably search around a bit more once I've got a way to charge the phone up. For now, I'm keeping it off most of the time, in case I end up needing it for something. February 18th, 2021. I saw something weird last night, or earlier this morning, I guess I should say. I've been staying up late, getting stuck into my books, and when I got up from my chair to grab some water around 2, I saw a movement out the kitchen window on the gravel road. I went to look, and there was a guy all bound up in a ragged jacket strolling down the single lane past my driveway through the ice and snow. He was easy to see. Even nighttime is bright out here with the snow getting so thick. It's a full 2 miles up the road to my driveway, and the only thing past my house is the vacant cabin over the ridge. I initially worried he was lost, but I've kind of settled into thinking he must be lodging up there. Maybe he drove out there in the days before the storm, and he's been unwilling to leave after the bad weather rolled in. I wouldn't blame him for not wanting to risk the road, and I've been keeping odd hours myself. If I wasn't still a bit unfamiliar out here, I might be taking midnight strolls as well. Anyway, otherwise the days are comfortable but boring. Without the heating on, I don't stay out too long during the day. It's too much hassle to warm back up when I get inside. For now, I'm happy to just prop my feet up, think about my projects, and quietly whittle the hours away. February 20th, 2021. The power was back on this morning, which is a relief. The pipes seem to be intact. What isn't a relief is what I found outside. When I went out to the outbuilding in the woods, I noticed some footprints in the snow on the driveway. They seemed to come up from the end of the road, turn onto my driveway, and walk the length of it to the woodline behind the trailer. The driveway gives way to the old ATV path once it hits the trees, and the prints just wound off into the woods down the trail. It's hard to know how old they were. The snow began to melt as soon as the sun came out this morning, but they couldn't have been from yesterday. Whoever made them had to have walked past during the night. I grabbed my shotgun and made to follow them, but the tracks meandered down across the property to the creek, where they seemed to stop. It was awfully cold weather to go walking down the stream ankle-deep in half-frozen water. I searched around, but I didn't see anything out of sorts in the valley, and eventually I went back home. Maybe whoever it was mistook my driveway for a path into one of the adjoining empty hunting lots, but I find that hard to buy into. My trailer is entirely visible from the road. I ended up calling Cody up, the owner of the bed and breakfast cabin up the way, and asking him whether there was anyone up on his property, but he told me there shouldn't be. He drove out this afternoon and looked the cabin over, and he didn't seem to think the back door had been broken on the little building, though it was hanging open when he pulled up, he said. We walked up the road to my only other neighbor's place, Stan Townsend, he's called, to see if he'd had any trouble with trespassers, and he was nice enough, if a bit reserved. Older guy, mountain hermit vibe. He owns an even larger plot than mine, and it's all cut through with game trails and footpaths, but he certainly hadn't been inviting friends out to hunt or hike. He mentioned his coonhounds had gone off the past few nights and woken him up, but he hadn't been able to see anything from his house. It sat a good 200 yards back from the gravel road through the trees. He thanked us for letting him know, and we traded numbers with him, in case any of us found anything out. We told the sheriff's department, but there's not a ton to be done out here. I helped Cody get a new lock installed on the back door of his cabin, and we gave the old building another once-over. It's ancient as the hills it's built on, but it's still in great condition. Probably sees a lot of overnight rentals in the summer, when the gorge gets most of its traffic. I agreed to keep my eyes open for any more activity on the road, and we parted ways. I'll be a little bit more wary the next few days. It's probably nothing, but I'd like to be cautious. It weirds me out that someone would walk all the way out here into the middle of nowhere and then tuck onto owned land like that. Anyway, I fitted up a padlock on the outbuilding in the woods, just to keep the tools in there safe. My parents should be bringing Guderian, my old German shepherd, out to my place tomorrow, along with some spare lumber for the coop. He's fairly alert, so I'll feel a bit less blind with him around. February 22nd, 2021. I've got Guderian settled in and the coop lumber stored in the outbuilding. Otherwise, everything's been quiet for the past couple days. The snow and ice have cleared up now, so I've been able to mark out the space for the coop structure when it gets a bit warmer in the afternoons. I've taken the dog on a few walks with me down into the valley, but I always keep a handgun on me. I'm not necessarily frightened, but I'd rather have it on me for now, while I'm still working out what the hell was wandering around up here. Guderian seems comfortable, though. A lot of space to roam around when we're out in the woods, and a secure place to keep him in the yard behind the fence when I'm doing work on the raised beds or the compost bins. He sticks close if we're out in the forest and he's occupied, but I worry he'll stray up the gravel road onto the back roads beyond if he's bored watching me mill around in the dirt on the lawn. He's fairly stupid around cars. The coyote population is pretty loud down in the valley at night, and that pisses him off, but he just growls and huffs from the floor of the trailer for the most part. Now that I've gotten the lumber and I can test the measurements I made when the power was out, I think I'll buy some wire in town in the next few days and get to work. As the weather clears up, I'd like to keep myself busy. February 28th, 2021. It's been a long job, but I've gotten a rudimentary coop set up, along with a little division of the fenced-in yard. The chickens will have about a third of the space to themselves, with the coop in the far corner, and Guderian can have the rest. I'm not really worried about him going after them. I'll try and acclimate him to them as I buy them, but beyond that he's a huge wuss. I can't imagine him doing more than barking at them, but I also don't want him rolling in chicken shit or stealing eggs. I've shored up the fence as well. I laid rock down along the base to deter digging under the wire and ran barbed wire along the top rail. Otherwise, I'll plant ivy out there come spring to climb the fence and act as a sort of visual barrier. It isn't fox or coyote proof, but I figure a breakthrough will take so much time or effort that I or Guderian will see or hear it happening and have a chance to respond. I keep the shotgun leaning against the counter near the back door and a handgun on my belt when I'm outside, so I'll be able to scare something off if I have to. And Guderian sounds dangerous, even if he isn't. I suppose I'll try and buy the chickens themselves once it starts to get a little warmer. Stan from up the road actually dropped by to offer me a bit of extra feed he had stored away after he saw me drive in with the wire the other day. Says his own chickens got wiped out by an illness or something last winter and he hasn't bothered to replace them. He still keeps goats, but apparently one of the 3 he's got hasn't come back up from the woods. He asked me to keep an eye out. I may have even seen tracks near the creek bed on a walk lately, though I'm no expert delineating between goats and other hoofed animals. I'll try and take my walks with that in mind the next few days, just to see whether I can help him out and return the favor. March 3rd. 2021. Guderian and I were traipsing through the woods this morning and I saw a fresh set of hoofprints near the creeks, smaller than an adult deer's, maybe a bit rounder. I started to follow them up the far side of the valley, but once we'd gotten a good distance into the woods, Guderian started acting weird, really skittish and hesitant to follow me. I ended up tracking the prints to the base of that strange little totem or sculpture on the incline, and Guderian wouldn't come close. He just hung back on the game trail we'd woven up, barking at a distance, keeping a close eye on me. There wasn't anything there. The prints seemed to just end at the base of the stone. The ground was rocky and dense up here, though, so that could easily mean nothing. They were barely visible on the hill, let alone once they wove off into the brush. I got a better look at the sculpture, though, now that it's clear of ice. The head is rudimentary, but it does sort of look cervid or deer-like. I'm thinking the stumps along the little impressions where ears are meant to be might have been horns once, but time has worn them off. The eyes are hollowed out, and the whole thing looks fairly off-putting, kind of like a 3D rendition of a lopsided kid's drawing. Guderian was going crazy, so I didn't linger, but I did end up telling Stan about the prints. He took a walk down on his own, but he didn't find anything either, though he did think they were probably his goat's tracks. I told him he's welcome to stroll through my plot any time if he's looking for his goats, and he told me I was welcome to use his for strolls and hunting when things are in season. We got to talking over my kitchen table, and he mentioned the little totem in my patch of woods. Said it was just like a couple he had on his land, though he didn't know if the foreign, rough-hewn, scratched markings down the front were exactly the same. The fact that there's more of them isn't exactly the weirdest thing in the world, but it does creep me out for some reason. We don't think these plots have been owned by the same person in recent memory, so maybe they really are some sort of strange native remnant that's just been forgotten, though the etched symbols down the front certainly don't look native. Regardless, it's been good to get to know Stan a bit more, and the fact that we can both keep an eye on our respective parts of the road makes me feel a lot more secure. March 7th, 2021. I've bought some seeds for sowing in April and planned out the layout in the garden beds, but other than that, there's not much to report as far as the property improvements go. Other than little touch-ups here and there to the outbuilding, I've just been relaxing and enjoying the change as spring starts to creep up on us. I finally had enough drive to get back into working on the novel I've picked up and abandoned intermittently the past 2 years. It's a strange thing, but I feel like now that I'm away from other people for most hours out of the day, I'm more comfortable working through the personal portions of the book. It's been cathartic to get back into the swing of typing for a few hours at night after wandering around daydreaming throughout the day. I've doubled the length of the manuscript over the past weekend alone. Granted, taking 40 pages to 80 isn't exactly huge, and I'm not distanced enough from the writing yet to tell whether I think it's any good. But I'm not sweating the little details at the moment. I'm just happy to be making progress again. Guderian had me freaked out on Friday night, the night of the 5th, that is, because he kept growling at the sliding glass back door. I did a few sweeps of the yard myself and let him out so he could patrol the fence line, but he never seemed to be able to spot whatever had gotten him so worked up, and I never noticed anything amiss. Maybe the squirrels are getting active again. March 11th, 2021. I had the soul scared out of me this afternoon. I was out in the yard stripping paint off an old chest, some antique of my great-grandfather's, so I could give it a stain. I guess I'd gotten drawn into my work, because when I caught motion out of the corner of my eye and turned to see a stranger walking up the driveway out of my woods towards the road, I hadn't so much as heard the gravel shift under his shoes. Guderian didn't even notice until I jumped up and headed for the fence line, but the guy didn't seem fazed at all by my calls or the dog's growls. He just kept moving right past my car and along his way. I guess the tension of the past few weeks got the better of me, because I went to intercept him. I actually jumped the fence because I didn't want to risk Guderian slipping out past my legs if I swung the gate open. I jogged up behind him and demanded he turn around and let me know who he was, and why he was on my land. When I grabbed him by the shoulder and swung him around, he finally wobbled to a stop, and I got my first good look at him. He was drawn, tiny, pale and covered in scratches and scars. He had dark hair shot through with gray, and his face was sunken and exhausted, but he didn't exactly look old. He had the air of premature, meth-addled age about him, old past his short count of years. His wardrobe didn't look any better. I don't mean that as a commentary on style either. His casually dressy shirt and pants were torn ragged, with patches ripped loose and seams torn wide like he'd been slogging through brush for weeks, and he stank like a sodden old sweat rag. The stranger took in a long breath and told me, "Just making sure it's working." I hadn't expected that. I don't know what I expected exactly, but it certainly was not that. By the time I'd asked him what he meant, he'd already tottered away from me into the road and begun his shaky way off, this time out towards the main highway past Stan's place. I didn't make to stop him this time, just turned on my phone and rung up first Stan to make sure he knew the stranger was headed his way, and then the sheriff's department. A few sheriff's deputies made it up there fast considering the distance, within 30 minutes or so, but by that time the stranger had disappeared, and he didn't seem to have walked along any of the roads up into the mountains. Stan had started out with a rifle to intercept the man right after my call, but probably fortunately for the both of them, Stan kept right on walking until he came to my driveway without seeing the guy. We suppose he wove off into the woods on either side of the lane. The cops stuck around to search the woods on both our plots with us, but by evening we'd come up with nothing, and we were forced to rein things in and head home. Stan and I agreed we'd both keep on our toes, and we called up Cody so he could double-check that his cabin was still in order, which it seemed to be. The stranger is too wasted away to seem like he poses any real threat. but I still don't like the idea of him wandering around out here. I have no idea how he's kept warm and dry. I've never spotted any signs of fires having been lit on our properties, and it's been miserably wet and cold for a month. He must be staying elsewhere, maybe a house a few roads over through the hills, and then wandering out here during particularly stringent meth binges or something. March 14th, 2021. It was a slow weekend, thankfully. No unwanted visitors or nocturnal dogs barking. Just writing and reading, along with doing a little food hoarding. Seeing how treacherous the roads up here get after a winter storm, I've decided I'll keep a few weeks of dehydrated meals on hand in a closet just in case the worst happens, and I get stuck up here a while. I'll hopefully have a ready supply of eggs by next winter, but I figure it doesn't hurt to have a backup. It's also spurred me into motion on buying a wood stove. I already wanted to put one in the main room, but now I'm set on getting it installed before I get buried in garden work in a month or so. It won't get any use this summer, but it'll be great to have on hand come next winter. March 21st, 2021. Stan helped me get the wood stove off the truck it got delivered on, and I've gotten it installed indoors with the heat shields and all now. I built a little outcrop of rock for it to sit in. Looks sort of fireplace-esque, almost a competent job. Otherwise, I got to do some groundhog hunting after Stan cued me into how many of them hang around the creek beds just before dusk. I suppose getting a drink before the coyotes usually move into the valley for the night. I bagged 2 this past week, and they made good eating. I've never tried it before, so it was interesting giving something new a chance. Speaking of coyotes, I haven't heard them at all this past week. They were so thick when I moved out here that you'd hear them yipping all through the night from different parts of the valley. I guess I'm happy about it, because Guderian has calmed way down without them around to bark back at, so my nights have been quieter. More small game for me, I suppose. March 26th, 2021. I was walking the trails I've cut through the property with Guderian this morning, and I came across Stan dragging something through the woods. It was his lost goat, he swore up and down. It had the same speckled fur on the snout, he said, and the same break in its right horn. But the thing had 4 rear legs. I don't mean 4 functional legs. 2 of them were small, vestigial ones hanging limply off its haunches like an absorbed twin's limbs. He stammered that the thing hadn't looked this way when it wandered into the trees, and he didn't need to beat around the bush with me. I'd seen the 3 of them along the road multiple times in the first few weeks I lived up here. I'd have remembered something so strange. He'd found it wallowing in the creeks near the border of our plots, struggling to breathe, externally unhurt but clearly in agony. Stan shot it rather than let it struggle on like that. There seemed to be something about its head, too, now that I dwell on it. I don't know if goats have eyes that large. That was a very odd animal, and the sight of it had Stan even more shaken up than I was. On some level, I can't believe it wasn't a coincidence, that another similar yet malformed goat from a surrounding farm wandered into the hills away from its pasturage to die alone, as some animals do. But the thing's ear was tagged. There's no way it just happened to have the same type of tab with the same name inscribed on it. It makes my skin crawl to think about it. Nothing I've ever heard of could do that to anything, animal or otherwise. Guderian wouldn't even go near us while we huddled over it, and I can't blame him. As I say, there was something awful about it. Something which somehow went deeper than the mere visual unpleasantness of the thing. The corpse felt off somehow, like it was a photoreal prop from some twisted stage play, not something which had been rasping and gasping for life just minutes ago. I helped Stan dump it in a sinkhole on his plot and cover it over with leaves and brush. Hopefully the quick end spared the thing some suffering. It's been hard to focus after that episode. The warmer weather will clear my mind a little, I think. April is right around the corner, and it'll do me good to focus on the plants. March 28th, 2021. I finally decided the forecasts moving forward were warm enough that I'd go ahead and buy the chickens, or pullets, I suppose I should say. There's 25 of them, as much as I thought I could manage without losing my mind this first year. It should only be a month or two before they start laying. Guderian has done surprisingly well with them. After he got to sniff them up close, he's been fairly gentle with them, like he tends to be with small dogs. I'm hoping that keeps up, so I don't have to worry about him stressing the chickens out as they get older. I've also gotten the ivy planted along the base of the fence. It'll be a bitch to cover it over if we end up getting frost in the next couple weeks, but I'll deal with that if it comes to it. It shouldn't get cold enough, but who knows? With things being as strange as they are around here at the moment, a departure from the weather forecast would be just one amidst a sea of much more unpleasant surprises. April 3rd, 2021. Almost made it through the week without incidents. The chickens were coming along fine, the days stayed warm, and I'd really started to crank through my writing. Then this morning, Stan called me up to tell me his 2 remaining goats had gone missing. What's more, he's been having trouble with his coonhounds. They keep baying after midnight, keeping him awake. He's tried to let them out, to have them lead him to whatever's upsetting them out in the dark so he can deal with it. But they won't go out, and he doesn't have the heart to make them. He's seen them act that way around bobcats. The dogs don't like them for some reason, even though they'd be more than capable of dispatching one. But for obvious reasons, the whole ordeal seems tied in his mind to more than just bobcats in the trees. I haven't noticed Guderian acting up, which I guess is good for my sleep schedule. I went out into the woods with Stan to look, but we didn't find much. There were a few goat tracks by the creeks in the valley, but there were so many deer prints down there it was impossible to pick them out once they got into the mud along the banks. I guess the deer are really living it up with the coyotes seemingly having left the area, but it's funny I've yet to see one. I saw a few scatter through the woods the first few weeks up here, and they certainly walked across the yard on a couple mornings before the fence went up. Anyhow, we didn't find anything in the end, and Stan went back to his place. I told him to call if he wanted me to walk the property with him again tomorrow, but he seemed so shaken that I doubt we'll be doing anything anytime soon. April 7th, 2021. After putting it off for the past few days, I got the garden planted today. I'll have to keep an eye on the weather in case it gets unseasonably cold in the near future, but this April is shaping up to be a warm one. I'm glad I ended up doing it. It's been good to worry less about what's going on and get buried in work again. I'm back to jogging and hiking the trails around the plot occasionally now. I keep my wits about me, but the deep woods are still just as relaxing an atmosphere to me now as they were initially, despite the stranger and the malformed goat. The trees and scrub are getting thick as summer grows ever nearer, and they muffle the sun and sound of the wider world. It's more thickly woven forest than I've seen anywhere outside of the tropics. You feel as if you've sunk into a green sea in the deepest parts of the valley, and it's been pleasant to detach from everything except bird song and babbling water for a few hours. I let Guderian stay up at the house for the time being. He's so timid down in the valley now that I don't want to stress him out dragging him down there. He seems to stay happy enough just keeping an eye on the chickens and snapping at flies in the garden while I'm out. On one level, I can't blame the poor animal. I keep dreading that I'll stumble across one of Stan's goats all mangled again. I still can't square that image away with what's physically possible, but to be honest, I've stopped trying to dig into it. Same with the totems. Maybe in the future, when a little time has passed, I'll do a deep dive. For the moment, with the images so fresh in my mind, I'd just be asking for lost sleep. April 9th, 2021. Guderian woke me up whining just before dawn, but I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. I've come to regret that. I think he knew something I didn't. Once I did roll out of bed and get through breakfast, I noticed one of the chickens was missing, so I went around in a huff to check the fence and inspect the woodline. I couldn't find a single thing wrong. Not a single bent link in the fence or slight depression in the gravel and rock along the ground meant to deter digging coyotes. The chickens really wouldn't have the motivation or the reach to get out from inside, especially not with the coop itself locked up for the night. My only thought is that something got over the fence and then clambered back out, but I find that hard to envision. There's no damage to the coop. The other chickens seem fine, at least, not shaken in the slightest. It's a strange situation. I got Stan out here and we ran even more barbed wire along the top of the fence line, just to shore things up, but I'm taking a few extra precautions. I have 2 old motion-triggered trail cameras I was going to use for deer later this year, but for now they'll watch the woodline near the fence so I can keep tabs on the chickens. If something did get in there, I'd like to know what it is and when it's coming around so I can deal with it. April 10th, 2021. I went out for a run this morning and spotted shoe prints on the muddy creek bank in the heart of the valley. I figured Stan had wandered over here at some point yesterday or right after dawn looking for the goats, but then they forked off up the far side of the valley, and I went to follow them. It was more than the direction that made me curious. They were small, I thought, nothing like the big prints of Stan's weighty boots. They wound up the hill, broke through brush, and ended right near the base of the weird little totem sculpture. An odd formation of 4 or 5 sticks had been neatly arranged in a standing cone in front of it, and the leaves and detritus of the woodland had been cleared away from the little rock outcrop from which the thing kept watch over the trees. Perched on top, sitting idle and staring off into the woods, was my missing chicken. She seemed dazed, stone still and free of any of the twitchy, telltale motions a chicken goes through as it moves or takes in its surroundings. After I made sure I was alone out there, a task which was made all the more nerve-wracking because the wandering prince had not seemed to leave the ledge after ascending to the heights, I went to grab her and lower her to the ground. The bird was cold, frightfully cold. The second I put any weight on her feathers, a black, clotted stuff seeped from her beak and dripped from her eyes, as if the bird's body was full to the brim with the stuff. So much poured out by the time I'd lifted the bird from the totem that I let it fall to the ground, and it barely flapped to slow the descent. It merely twitched its feeble legs after striking the hard stone. The substance, which I'd first taken to be blood, stank like a chemical mixture, though I can't put a finger on any scent in particular. It had a horrible, artificial smell, one which my mind for some reason links with preservative fluid. The stuff kept coming as the bird lay still at my feet, and I was chilled to see it blink and clack its beak soundlessly against the oncoming flood of whatever strange bile this was. It was still alive. I didn't think twice about dispatching it with the handgun to spare it whatever the hell that was. That seems a bit overdone, perhaps, but I didn't want to cut it with my pocket knife or risk striking it with a tree limb. I didn't want the stuff touching me, and my imagination conjured up images of the animal bursting like a balloon and drenching the surrounding forest with the foul stuff oozing from its orifices in thick, languid streams. It did rupture when I shot it from afar, but the jelly-like consistency of the black liquid kept the stuff relatively contained. I covered it over with dry leaves, hoping to contain or absorb a bit of the foul stuff without having to get too close to it, and then I went straight home. I've talked about it with Stan, of course. He came over after I called, and we commiserated over how progressively otherworldly things were getting out here. I resolved to call the sheriff's department out again to look over the footprints, despite Stan's assertion they'd do nothing. They didn't do anything, but that wasn't the point. I kept hoping on some insular level that if there was someone back there in the woods, a thought which made my skin crawl, they'd eventually get tired of having to scramble around hiding day in and day out from regular sweeps by police. Then again, expecting someone as disheveled as the stranger I saw last month to be rational about the risks they were taking is perhaps naive. Still, it makes me feel slightly better to have the woods swept through, even if only in a cursory sort of way. Cody is coming out tomorrow afternoon to check out his cabin and start cleaning it up for summer, when he usually gets people renting it out for a night or two at a time. I think we sort of spurred him into action early by saying we thought the stranger was still out there, and he wants us to go down to the end of the lane with him to scope the place out. After finding the door pushed in last time, he's understandably nervous about going in alone. We'll all be out there around 2. At this point, I don't know what to pin on the trespasser and what to put down as my own frayed nerves. The bile was weird, but the animal wasn't necessarily poisoned or tampered with. Maybe the chicken was already ill with something and the guy just stumbled across it in the woods, dazed and confused. The ledge with the totem on it could just be where he rides out his highs or looks out over the valley. It's certainly a good view, even through the thickening canopy. Whether my most irrational worries about him are right or wrong, I do know I'm not letting him walk away if I see him again. I'll break limbs if I need to keep him still until the police arrive. I've only had a couple months out here, and I'm not about to passively cede my peace and quiet to anyone. April 11th, 2021. I almost backed out of the cabin visit today. Another chicken had gone missing from the coop this morning, and I was considering trying to track it down out in the woods. It wasn't even practicality that decided the issue for me. When Cody called me up to see if I was ready to ride down the road with him, I was second-guessing my courage, hesitant to go walking back into the valley alone looking for another lost animal. I was, I suppose, wary of what I might find. At this point, though, I wish I had. No malformed animal could have matched the cabin. What we found up there was far, far worse. When we rumbled up to the front porch, Stan was the first to notice the front door had been forced in. It had been propped up afterwards, so that from a distance, the placid front of the building still looked undisturbed. We pushed in, armed, making sure we made ourselves known every step of the way. The interior was barren, stripped of the modest furniture which had decorated the place, though to where it had gone, we could not say. It was only once we hit the small kitchen, where a dark, downward stairway yawned beyond an unhinged door, that the awful stink overcame us. It was, I told Stan, exactly like the smell of the dying chicken I'd found. We hesitated, the basement dark and the lights not deigning to work, none speaking to the dilemma which weighed heavy on all our minds. Who would descend first? Cody took to the stairs in the lead, Stan right behind. I'm not proud that I only pushed on down after both the others had almost disappeared from view, dragged along in their wake by my desire not to appear like a coward. The aged wooden steps clung to a stained rock wall and wound their way around a support beam as they met a corner, then dipped down to the dirt floor of the old-fashioned cellar below. We navigated by the murky light spilling down from the kitchen at our backs, our ears ringing with soft, almost pained chittering of some kind. hesitating to illuminate the basement, as if we knew it would be a bad idea to shed light on what waited beneath us. Eventually, though, Cody's boots hit the floor, and he flipped on a light, revealing the abhorrent mass which twitched and writhed in the shadows at the center of the windowless room. It was only a moment's observation before we retreated up the stairs, but those scant seconds were enough to leave an impression. A man's corpse, that of the stranger who'd wandered across my land, I'm sure, lay on the floor in a shallow sinkhole which had been formed amidst a web of dusty scribblings on the dirt floor. I believe they were similar to the markings on the totems in the woods, but I can't know for certain. They were too obstructed by the things which were attached to him. The concept of the Rat King is part myth, part reality, but describes the idea that a brood of mice or rats can get their tails so badly intertwined that they become permanently stuck, and move as one confused carpet of seething limbs across the ground. It's been observed with squirrels and other rodents when sap or fur gets affixed to the tails of a number of animals who live in close proximity with one another. This was something similar, but it was not sap or filthy hair which connected them. A whole slew of animals, from field mice to my missing chickens, some living and some dead, were connected to the corpse of the stranger, and to each other, by a network of tails and distorted limbs which seemed to sink into the flesh of the next animal in line. It was as if their skin had been loosened and molded together like hot wax before hardening again, leaving them to strain and tug and gnaw at one another, to grope and squeal and gasp in the dark against the organic prison which restrained them. Stan's goats, one still twitching and one long dead, splayed out like wings or jagged antlers from the core of the moving carpet, their stomachs bloated and their hind legs lost in the shuddering mass of fur and wiry sinew. As I say, we only glimpsed all this for a moment. Even if the sight had not been so unearthly, the smell was so thick it made us lightheaded, and each of us silently worried we'd lose consciousness under its metallic chemical haze. We clambered back up the stairs, retching, and called for the sheriff's department yet again. They were, at this point, beginning to sound frustrated at the repeated calls to this forgotten corner of the county. But once they'd seen and smelled the thing in the cabin's cellar, the frustration became something altogether different. I watched with the others as they carried the individual constituent parts of the now dead mass of tissue out in bags. We were questioned. How could we not be? But our words revealed little save our own terror and revulsion, and the police knew by now the long saga of intrusion which had haunted our properties. They preserved what they could of the chaotic scene, had us show them the relevant totems and sigils spread throughout the woods where we suspected the writing on the cellar floor originated, and let us go. Retreating to my house, we all stayed up late into the night, speculating and wondering, but never coming upon anything tangible. Cody drove home eventually, and Stan rode along with him, back down the road to his place. I'm left to stew on the day's events in solitude now, as all of us will be tonight, I guess, and it's not a good feeling at all. I haven't even tried to dig into the feasibility of such a thing, to give it a rational name and a rational reason for having occurred. I'm far past that now. Whatever's been going on out here is not rational, and it cannot be rationalized. It'll have to suffice for now that this might be the end of it. With the stranger gone, I can hold out some small hope that this is all finally behind us. April 18th, 2021. I've been taking it easy for the past week or so. The chickens have started laying and the plants have really taken off as the spring heat rolls in. It's rainy enough that I've been spared a lot of watering, and the compost piles are expanding as I distract myself adding chicken manure and the last of the dry leaves I could scrape together. I should feel much more comfortable now, There's been no more missing chickens, and I've yet to hear anything strange from Stan. The happenings that plagued us the past couple months should be behind us, but I haven't ever felt relieved or unburdened. I'm more on edge now walking the woods than I've ever been, and Guderian still refuses to go down into the valley with me. On one level or another, I feel like I'm just letting past experiences take root and overshadow what should be a laid-back spring. But it could also be that I haven't been sleeping well. Guderian's been whining after midnight the past few days, something which originally had me somewhere between furious and petrified. But I haven't ever been able to notice anything strange in the yard or on the road when I look out the windows or make a loop around the yard with the shotgun. I do get an odd feeling out there, though, probably down to paranoia. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched from across a room or something. I don't know what's getting him worked up, but it can't be the coyote calls. They still haven't started yipping and screaming again. I did see them in the woods near dusk as I walked back home yesterday, though. About 24 of them bunched up on the creek bank, sitting in silence. A bit odd, but nothing much compared to everything else. I'll have to ask Stan if his dogs are still giving him trouble at night, and maybe get some input on whether the coyotes keeping quiet is weirding him out. He's more familiar with the area, after all. I'm likely second-guessing things which don't need to be second-guessed, but it'll help calm me down to talk things over with someone who understands, at least. April 19th, 2021. I'm an idiot. Stan told me he'd had his dogs barking the night away for almost a week after the cabin visit. But when I mused over what could be stirring the dogs up, he mentioned that he'd seen a group of deer acting strangely on a game camera he kept behind his tottering old barn near the forest. He showed me some of the footage, and to my already weary mind it was far more than just strange. The milky green nocturnal footage showed a huge group of deer of varying ages standing in the brush at the woodline, their eyes pinpricks against the gloom behind them, just watching. Dozens of them, perhaps 100, would trigger the camera with their approach before freezing in place throughout the minute or so the thing recorded, most just silhouettes in the farther reaches of the trees. They seemed to be staring off past the barn towards the house. Stan said he'd gone out the night prior to try and spook them after the dogs got worked up, planning on firing a shot to scatter them. But the way his dogs howled and bayed made him reconsider before pushing out the back door. He couldn't really see the woods from his back porch, but he could see the glint of some eyes in the glow of the porch lights, and, for whatever reason, he couldn't bring himself to go out there. I hadn't thought about my own cameras for a week or more. I'd thought to check them after finding the second chicken missing, but in the wake of finding that mangled mess up at Cody's cabin, I'd just let the things fester where they hung in the trees. I figured I already knew where the chicken went, and I didn't want to deal with seeing the stranger scale my fence or watch the trailer from the woods. That felt like masochistic self-torture in view of what had happened. I'd told myself it could wait, and had soundly forgotten about them, right up until I watched the horde of vacant, servid faces on Stan's camera over his shuddering old computer monitor. I found equally disturbing images awaiting me back home. The stranger was there, staring in the dark from beside my outbuilding before taking my chicken all those days ago. But several nights later, the deer came. It was the same scene as it stands, save they gathered deeper in the woods. The scrub was less thick up near my place, and I couldn't help but imagine that they wanted to hide. It would be easy to shrug that off. Of course they want to hide, they're deer. But this seemed different. This, and I know this is a paradoxical way to put it, seemed predatory somehow. I'll have to keep on my toes the next couple nights. I don't know what's going on, but I'm fairly certain they aren't just looking at my fledgling garden. April 20th, 2021. I know it isn't deer season, but I ended up letting loose a whole 20-round drum of shotgun slugs into the woods night before last, and the deer seemed to have shoved off. I admit it was as much my own anxiousness as Guderian's that made me try and drive them away, but I do feel better without them around at night. They didn't budge until I'd been firing for a while, and even though I must have hit a few of the things, I found no blood come morning, and I haven't found any corpses back in the valley either. Guderian's certainly better rested. I called Stan up to report on developments over here this morning, but he didn't answer, and I figured I'd leave him be. He seems like the type to brood over upsetting things, and the past month has been nothing short of upsetting. He probably needs his share of silence before he's ready to slide back into routine. April 21st, 2021. I went out for a run early in the afternoon, just to get out of the house and take my mind off things for a while. A soft drizzle was coming down, but I didn't think much of it. The forecasts hadn't called for rain, so I figured it'd just peter out after a few minutes. I'd made it about halfway around the property, crossing the creeks and climbing the other side of the valley, and I stopped to catch my breath on the way back down. The rain picked up, and though the canopy overhead was getting thick enough I didn't really feel soaked, I figured I should pick up the pace. I pressed on, and just as I hit the valley floor, movement made me turn and look down the creek into the mossy chasms the water has carved into the hills. I swear as I record this, I saw something dark lurch backward into the rocks out of view, like a head withdrawn from a doorway. I stopped. I didn't know what to do. I'd come down unarmed, expecting a short jaunt around the woods. As a few seconds slipped by and I homed in on the chasm downstream, I noticed how silent the woodland seemed to be. Save for the babbling brook and the patter of rain overhead, the only sound which broke the shadowy woodland was the pining howl of the wind as it skirted the valley far above. I decided on continuing the run. I feel like a coward for not following up. I could have at least thrown a rock or something to see if an animal was back there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been observed, though, an uncomfortable sensation that didn't leave me until well after I had burst from the woods and taken shelter in the trailer, where Guderian whined and sulked in the kitchen. The rain hasn't helped settle me down. It's boiled over into a real storm, and the clatter against the roof brings my mind back to the trees. I'm totally deaf to the sounds of the forest, and I can't see through the sheeting downpour past the fence. It's likely mostly my own imagination doing most of the legwork, but I feel even more uneasy tonight than I did back when the stranger was stumbling around the woods. I won't make the mistake of going back down there unarmed again. April 23rd, 2021. Stan woke me up just after dawn with a knock on my door and drove me up to his place, insisting I wouldn't believe what had happened the night before without seeing it for myself. I obliged, though I figured I was just about ready to believe anything at this point. His barn, old and just as crooked as it had always been, had been flown into by hundreds of birds. A flock of varied woodland species, from thrushes, woodpeckers, and warblers to several rose-red cardinals, lay dead or dying in the grass, their bodies broken against the solid wall of the long-standing structure hours into the night. There were so many that the sudden, almost simultaneous impact had woken Stan from sleep, though with the strangeness which had haunted the region since February, he'd put off investigating until after the sunrise shored up his courage. We actually ended up contacting the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife to report the incident. It was the only relevant place we could think to report the event to in the moment. They asked for images and details, which we provided by email, but I don't think they really understood the surreal nature of it. I don't know that I've ever seen so many types in one place. Even a well-stocked feeder at a public park would be hard-pressed to rally up so many sorts of birds. Whatever might have driven them to brain themselves against an opaque wood wall hours past midnight is a mystery to us. Now that I have cause to think on it, I feel like it's been days since I've heard birds down in the valley. Maybe I'm projecting my lingering fear into the woods after what I thought I saw a couple days back, but spring should be a time of year rife with activity, and yet the whole place seems vacant. Vacant save for the deer, I suppose. There's never a dearth of those tracks down near the creeks, where they gather in the mud in droves. Maybe it's all the rain we've gotten. The garden, at least, has been taking care of itself. If anything, the continuous onslaught of rain over the past few days makes me worry about drainage, but I think the raised beds have enough height to them the roots are safe from drowning in the downpour. It has the meteorologists stumped, but that always seems to be the case up here. Stan said it was more like reading palms than measuring data in these parts. I've always enjoyed dreary weather, though. All the more excuse to fire up the wood stove and unwind with a pile of books to distract me. April 25th, 2021. Things are just as tense up here, and the woods seem just as ominous. But it could be worse. I'm lucky my place sits up in the hills, because this unrelenting rain is beginning to have big repercussions for the surrounding area. Small towns like Stanton, Campton, and Beattyville are plagued with overflowing streams and rivers, and a massive amount of property damage has been done. Most of the region is under a boil water advisory, and there's been a lot of power outages due to flood debris taking out lines or damaging transfer stations. A handful of people have been killed, and as the National Guard gets called in to try and mitigate the destruction, the unprecedented weather is becoming an ever larger cause for concern. Climate change is pointed at by men who've never set foot in these mountains, and talking heads on television try to theorize about the weird meteorological data coming out of eastern Kentucky. But locals talk in far different terms when we're amongst ourselves. The one run-down Big Lots I can make it to without having to risk flooded roads is packed each hour of the day by frightened patrons muttering about everything from divine punishment to government weather manipulation and everything in between. The rain hasn't stopped once in a week. It waxes and wanes, sure, but the clouds and the wind never relent, and thunder seems always to crouch just beyond the horizon. I can't help but assign a malign, malicious quality to it. The weather combined with the off-putting shadow that's crept over the forest has me more convinced than ever that something inexplicable is going on. This isn't just some coincidental chain of rare events that have wowed me into being afraid. There's something bigger going on, and there's nothing good about it. Stan seems to think so too, though we've both beat around the bush when talking about it. We've worked together to clear some little runoff creeks that empty down the mountain slopes so our gravel road doesn't suffer too much in the downpour, but otherwise we're left to stew inside. Cody moved up into his rental cabin yesterday with some of his valuables, looking to escape the flooding down in the valleys, and I made sure to visit this afternoon. It must feel tense in there, after all we saw in the cellar, and I can't help but imagine he feels nervous behind those creaking old walls. He's doing well, all things considered. Fortunately, we should remain untouched so far up here on the mountain. The most I have to worry about is the garden. The raised beds drain well, but there's only so much draining they can do. The plants seem to be thriving so far, though, even with the overcast weather gnawing up the sunlight. The whole garden is springing right up, as is the forest. Hopefully that holds up until the storm blows over. April 26th, 2021. When Stan knocked this afternoon, I was buried in my writing, and I immediately assumed the worst. I expected he'd give me yet another thing to worry about, that he'd weave another tale of nocturnal visitors or inexplicable animal deaths. I can't blame him for wanting to share his findings, to make sure he isn't going mad out here in the hills on his own. But I'm about at the limits of my tolerance for the strange, and I'd like to spend a week or two without questioning my own mental faculties for a change. He stood looking wide-eyed and rattled on the cheap concrete stoop, though, which blunted my irritation. Behind him stood a tall, gaunt, older man bundled in rain gear who I didn't know at all. He introduced himself as Whipple Van Horn, a specialist in linguistics who'd once taught over in Clarksville, not far from Danville, where I was born. Stan told me he knew something about the dead stranger and about the sculptures in the woods. It chilled me, after dreading the two were connected for so long, to hear them linked, even if I had no grasp of our visitor's credentials. Perhaps because of this fear, I was prepared to fight tooth and nail against any assertions Van Horn might make, desperate to preserve what little comfort I could. As we strode into the woods and the calm, collected Van Horn got to talking, however, that ceased to be an option. He began by telling me about the dead man, an old colleague of his missing for several months, with whom he'd been digging into what seemed like a ritual suicide in Quirk, a small, now abandoned hamlet not far from his home. It was a gruesome story, very small-towny Charles Manson stuff, replete with slaughtered animals and a long history of strange occurrences around the cult which had occupied the settlement. It was even stranger events which led to the professor's involvement, first in translating an old religious text the cult's strange leader had penned in a long-dead Semitic language, and then in responding to an increasingly threatening succession of happenings in the surrounding countryside. His story about a child gored and trampled by uncharacteristically aggressive deer was particularly grim, conjuring up those awful green-tinted images from my game cameras just a scant few nights ago. The two academics had both contributed to the project of translating the strange language in which the cult had operated, but only Van Horn's friend, Kotkin, had accompanied the police into the hills when it came time to try and put a stop to whatever inexplicable goings-on were plaguing the Quirk Wood. Kotkin had ended up mad, Van Horn thought. Something to do with a thing he encountered in a subterranean cellar or maze of some kind under the ruins of Quirk. Then, somehow, after months of wandering on foot through the winter woods, he'd ended up here, some 80 miles away, where he'd raised hell along the road for weeks before finally meeting his inexplicable end in the cabin. Though Kotkin had taken their records with him on his final journey, and no books or writings had been found with him upon his death, Van Horn had enough of his own notes to puzzle out what Kotkin might have been trying to do. It was with no small amount of trepidation that he told us in halting breaths we needed to show him the totems in the valley, so he might see whether his worst fears had been realized. Though we had to stop and wait a few times to allow the wizened old linguist to keep pace and catch his breath, his excitement made him hard-pressed to sit still, and before long we'd be on our way again. As we moved, he'd ask whether the wildlife had been acting strangely, or inquire about the abnormal ferocity of the local weather. I found the all-encompassing rain more and more disconcerting as Van Horn told of the deluge which had engulfed Boyle County before the Quirk horror had taken hold. I kicked myself for not trusting the fear I'd felt seeing the strange deer along the woodline, or the uncanny dread I'd experienced looking over the mounds of dead birds. By the time we reached the rocky ledge upon which the weird sculpture stood, I felt as if we were approaching a gallows, and the look which crossed Van Horn's bespectacled face as he painstakingly translated the lettering on the totems certainly didn't make me feel much better. Having already seen the couple totems on Stan's end of the valley, Van Horn jotted down some notes with a pad he'd brought along, all the while awkwardly sheltering the thing under his windbreaker against the rain. Then he had us lead him back out of the woods. He wouldn't tell us exactly what he thought they said, just told us he had to make sure that he didn't want to spook us over nothing. He rambled then about how there were things beneath the earth. He made vague allusions to something he'd seen when he was much, much younger beneath Mexico. Some sort of ruin, I took it to be. But this, he said, was something far different. Something far worse. This, he told us, wasn't just strange. It was wicked. He worked himself up into shivers, and we worried for his health when he doubled over and vomited halfway out of the valley, but he shook us off. It was blackish, his bile, something which initially had me thinking to the chicken who'd languished on the totems all those tense days ago. But he waved the worry away. Stomach cancer, he said. Not much time left. Ominous as a scryer foretelling doom, he then cryptically added that there might not be much time left for any of us. Whipple Van Horn left in a rush, feverish to get back to his notes. He did stop at the door of his car, though, to urge caution. There was a large gash in Kotkin's stomach, he told us. Something lost on us in the vile shadows of the cellar. Van Horn had reason to believe there was a newborn, nameless something in the woods. Something dangerous. Whatever had caused the trouble up in Quirk had likely followed Kotkin into our valley in search of the totems. And now, he feared, there was more than one. We asked if it was safe to stay. For the first time, leaving seemed to be on the table. Retreat, at last, seemed necessary. But he doubted leaving would do much good. No place would be safe if things were allowed to march on as they had been, Van Horn said. We should keep indoors at night, however. The woods would become an altogether different place in the dark. Even when the linguist had rolled off into the distance down the gravel road, Stan and I never checked to see if the other had bought into Van Horn's story. There was nothing unhinged or dishonest in him. He'd spoken with the weight of one who'd had a terrible epiphany, and his fear was evident in each syllable he'd spoken on the mountainside. His words roused every terror we'd felt in the depths of the increasingly silent, rain-haunted nights alone at home, worrying over every snapped branch and swaying shadow beyond the windows. I did follow up later, looking into the happenings in Quirk over the past 2 years, but that only reaffirmed my fears. We checked in on Cody afterward, but we couldn't bring ourselves to try and tell him. Not yet, at least. We'd come off as madmen, surely. After all, Cody hadn't been here throughout most of the preceding strangeness. There was no telling how much he'd rationalized away, and how deeply he understood the dread which had risen up in us. We warned him to take care after dark, and told him about the strange behavior of the wildlife in the area, but we left it at that. We'll keep in touch with him as things move forward. Tonight, Stan and his dogs are lodging over here, sleeping on an air mattress in the study. I only have a few rooms, and the area around the house is a little more open over here, so we figured it was the more defensible of the two places to hole up. I can't say whether guns will help us much, but we're certainly armed. While I don't imagine we'll get much sleep, we've agreed to start resting during the day. With no way to make others understand our plight and nothing to do but wait on Van Horn, we are prepared to do just that. April 28th, 2021. It's been a couple days, and there's been no word yet from Van Horn. We are just trying to keep things regular as they can be under the circumstances. Stan goes back down the way in the mornings to check in on his house and make sure nothing's been tampered with, while I get the chickens fed and make sure the garden beds aren't spilling over with all this rain. The nights are tense. The dogs can't settle down, and they are constantly up in arms about noises they hear outside. Night before last, I thought I heard a sound like drums down in the valley around dusk, but Stan couldn't hear anything past the baying of the dogs and the patter of the constant rain. Last night, though, these sounds were louder, undeniable, rhythmic and low. Both times they seemed to drone on for an hour or so before subsiding. Whether there's still wildlife vigils on the trailer at night, I can't say for certain. The game cameras have been set off a few times the past several nights, but I feel it's just been the storms triggering the motion detectors. There's nothing but empty trees on most video it's taken, and a few seem blank, with a black screen rolling along in silence for a moment before they cut out. Maybe the constant damp is messing with the cameras. I guess that's a bad thing, but on one level or another, it would almost be better not to have to check them every day and worry all morning over what I might see lurking amidst the branches. I can't even see the outbuilding back there beyond the woodline anymore. The forest is thick, far thicker than anything I've ever seen at the height of summer. I guess the weeds and scrub are living it up in the rainfall. The landscape has a sort of bloated, hideous unnaturalness to it, as if the whole landscape is a gaseous corpse floating down a river. It feels unhealthy, unwholesome somehow, despite all the greenery. I can't just shrug that off as discomfort now. I'm convinced there's something more to it than that. There's something about the dark, tepid forest's growth which makes me feel like it's reaching oaken claws out to clasp at us. One lone island in a sea of teeming, glistening trees. Just thinking of my placid retreats by the creeks down in the valley makes my blood run cold now. How twisted they must be after so many days fed by this uncanny rain, starved of what little cloud-covered sunlight there is by a canopy which looks more and more like a woven roof of sickly greens. I'll have to start cutting the growth back during the day before long, if I can, just to keep it from devouring the yard, and us with it. On a different note, I learned during a call with my brother that our immortal storms are creeping into the wider region. Richmond, Danville, and Winchester have had several straight days of constant rainfall to match our own, and a procession of towns running outward to Ashland on the West Virginia border are experiencing a similar phenomenon. With the central and eastern parts of Kentucky facing similar damage to the torrents which keep on falling up here, the state is abuzz with activity. Even here, helicopters pass overhead night and day in spite of the weather, an oddity in a place so remote. The same sense of unease that's overtaken us here seems to have been exported along with the rain. Residents are leaving to visit relatives or friends elsewhere and dragging belongings with them. The news is clogged with dreary, rain-soaked images of interstates crammed with traffic and families giving interviews about damaged property and upturned lives. My brother tells me my parents are fretting, and that he's worried himself that the storms might reach him in faraway Louisville. As more and more people in higher and higher positions failed to explain what was happening, even more of those listening to them for answers began to panic. I'd invite my family up here, where I've got food stashed away and the mountains are head and shoulders above all this runoff. But the roads to get here through Richmond or Winchester are becoming treacherous, and unless something changes, it's only going to get worse. They'll rent rooms or bed and breakfasts out of state if things keep on, though I hope for all our sakes it doesn't come to that. April 29th, 2021. Something very bad has happened west of Winchester, on the outskirts of Lexington. Sometime after dark last night, some sort of riot seems to have broken out in the wooded suburbs there. An industrial park and hundreds of homes seem to have been destroyed, with fires becoming so large that even the rain couldn't contain them. The area is crawling with guardsmen, and there's word many more are being shipped in. Social media chatter seems to indicate there could be hundreds dead, thousands if you believe the wildest estimates. Only local media and unofficial discourse seem to be interested in finding out what's happening, though. The news is strictly sticking to helicopter footage of fires and rubble-strewn residential streets, and online platforms seem to quickly restrict or remove the shaky videos and tweets locals make about the horrors of the night. Stan was awake all through this morning, glued to the phone and the television, and he swears he saw something on the Facebook live feed of some Winchester acquaintance he knew through his work as an electrician. The man had been in his car, discussing the chaos just down the street from his home before dawn, fleeing in a hastily packed car with his wife, before coming to a stop and complaining that people were blocking the road up ahead. Though the feed cut out not long after, Stan swore that when the flustered man had swung his phone up to scan the winding wooded lane ahead, the ravening mass of yelling things in the milky glare of the headlights had not been rioters. They were, Stan said, something else entirely. The woman in the passenger seat wailed, the man swore, and the stream was cut. Stan had just enough time to capture a grainy screenshot on his phone, clumsily pulling it up for me after he'd shaken me from my uneasy sleep. The figures were moving, obscured by the blurry motion of the streamer's own phone in the rain against the windshield. But they looked strange, jagged and elongated, deformed. Having looked at the image on and off for hours, I'd swear the leading silhouettes in the crowd were horned. There are many such images circulating online, though they seem to get scrubbed as quickly as they're posted. One, a video from the roof of what looks to be a factory, shows a group of countless, perhaps thousands, of dark figures capering at the edge of a forest running the length of the property. Through the downpour, the men, all workers at the facility, I assume, speculate as to what they are doing out there. Noises can be heard, something like drums and horns, far distant in the trees, and there's a sort of animal cackling or braying that breaks through the patter of rain every few seconds. About 30 seconds in, the trees in the forest begin to shake and sway, as if shoved aside, like meadow grass parting before an exploring dog. One of the men watching asks if the others hear something. Then a blast sounds from farther down the building, and the camera pans to reveal that a plume of fire has burst from an adjoining warehouse. The video ends as the workers scatter to respond to the fire, but not before the man filming accidentally pans back towards the open lawn in the forest across the way. There, the leaping, dancing figures are no longer hesitating at the woodline. They are running, bleating like goats, moving as one indistinct pitch-black mass into the open and closing the distance with the building. A dark wave, bound to crash against the tin siding of the factory. I'm shocked beyond words, really. I think we both are. Cody came over to discuss things around noon. Said he'd been unable to contact relatives in Lexington all through the day. He seems distressed. He says there was knocking at his door last night, and once we confirmed it hadn't been us, he was silent for a long while. He asked whether we'd seen anything in the woods lately, and I told him we'd seen deer acting strangely. We left it at that. Cody seems too distraught to delve into things at the moment, and I don't want to force it on him. Stan drove down to what areas of town can still be reached to pick up what scant food he could and ask around about what others are doing. They all seem to be armed and vigilant. More than a few are talking about figures in the woods at night, and most are pooling resources and staying together in secure homes with other families. A fair number are missing, and though for now the distraught relatives are assuming the floodwaters in the valleys are to blame, Stan has heard more than a few old-timers outside gas stations lay the blame on different, altogether more frightening things. I can't say I disagree with them. Waiting for more information has become agonizing. We've called an old University of Clarksville number listed for Van Horn, but to no avail. We feel helpless, the both of us, each time thunder rolls outside or those slow-beating drums sound down in the flooded valleys. Our hearts skip beats. The dogs have ceased barking at the strange noises that come up from the woods at night, as if I can't help but think they're afraid of being heard. It's all I can do to keep myself from daring to look out the windows after sunset, and I celebrate each sunrise. April 30th, 2021. Another day spent staring into the storm-soaked trees was interrupted when Van Horn finally called us this afternoon and told us he was closing in on a possible solution. He felt obliged to tell us since he pulled us into all this, but he kept any real details close to his chest, something I can't really blame him for, given how dangerous he clearly thinks the situation is. Van Horn was apparently contacted by a group referring to itself as the Call of the Mountain, some sort of clandestine occultic order, back in November, soon after Kotkin first went missing. Their organization claimed to be devoted to containing something they believed was buried beneath central Appalachia, a god whose name had long ago fallen into obscurity, and who is known simply as the Dreamer. They believed the labyrinth beneath Quirk had contained some fragment of this long-forgotten god, one of the keys, as the Call of the Mountain put it, and that the ritual which wiped out the hamlet had set this key loose. Now they claimed the key, acting through Kotkin, had set free another. The aftermath of this grotesque liberation was the horror we'd stumbled upon in the cellar of the rental cabin, they claimed. Kotkin's broken body was merely a shell used to bring forth the second key into the world, like an incubator tossed aside the second it outlived its usefulness. Only one key remained bound in the soil, and the Call of the Mountain were bent on preventing its escape. If the Dreamer were to awaken and rise from beneath the hills, it would be the end of the material world as we know it. Van Horn had initially taken these occultist strangers to be madmen, but they'd proven time and again to know where Kotkin was headed in advance, and provided preternatural explanations of the weather patterns and odd goings-on which had plagued the region. The Call of the Mountain claimed the Dreamer, just beginning to stir from its long slumber, was behind the storms which had reared up in Boyle County. As it moved further and further towards consciousness, the storms, and the twisted, bloated woodlands which the storms fed, would creep ever further into the wider world. Though Van Horn didn't know the particulars, he said the storms and the bloated forests were projections of some kind, projections meant to replicate the strange world from which the Dreamer hailed. The Call of the Mountain is apparently almost ready for a last, desperate counterstrike. They don't think they can end the rituals these so-called keys are putting into motion through rituals of their own, but they do think they could kill the mortal servants of the Dreamer. Groups like the one which started all this in Quirk are apparently scattered across the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia, centered on Red River Gorge, where the last key lies hidden. They plan to track down the men and women in the Dreamer's service, end them, and stop their plot before the final key is found, but they'll need help. The Call of the Mountain are apparently few in number, fewer even than the servants of the Dreamer, and they are already spread thin. Travel was becoming treacherous, and floods or fallen trees were the least of their worries. The darkest corners of the thickening woodland were teeming with life, they said. The same sort of malignant life that had spilled forth towards Lexington. These were the Dreamer's spawn, Van Horn claimed. and the longer we waited, the bolder they would become. Unhinged as all this sounded, every word of it struck true. Looking back now, hours later, I found myself second-guessing everything, questioning whether, just maybe, I could still find a way to rationalize everything which has happened. Van Horn had just informed us a group of some obscure religious sect were about to murder the members of another, something which should have repulsed me, but it didn't. I know something inexplicable is happening out here, and whatever it is, it's far beyond reason. Calm, collected understanding has no place out here, where the rain-fattened trees ring with the thunder of ominous drums. I volunteered immediately, I suppose overwhelmed by the need to end the inexplicable dread which has slowly built in me since seeing Kotkin's vacant eyes in March. But Stan stopped me. He told me he'd go, and then I could stay here to help keep an eye on the valley and mind the dogs. Stan is older, but still formidable, and he has little to lose. Most family are estranged or dead, by his own admission, and what comfort he's found in the mountains is now standing on a razor's edge. I guess after months spent quaking in his home, he's done hiding. Stan worked out where to meet his companions with Van Horn, this call of the mountain, before helping me sort out the property. We moved food and provisions over from Stan's place to mine, to consolidate and take record of everything we had. He took my semi-automatic shotgun and all the clips I've got for it, plus most of our solid slugs. I've got an old pump action and a hell of a lot of bird and buckshot, which I figure will serve me fine around here. With neither of us knowing how long they'd be, Stan said his goodbyes and rolled off in his battered truck. Van Horn will try and keep me updated, or so he told me. I went out this evening and bought everything I could afford to buy, mostly dried food stores and things I'll need if I'm stuck out at the trailer, to add to what I stowed away after the ice storm. I also cut up some soaked wood in case the power fails and leaves me dependent on the wood stove to cook or purify water. I left it in the outbuilding, and with any luck it'll dry up in a week or so. Now I just need to hope I'm brave enough to push back into the looming trees to get it if the time comes. It feels eerie here, alone, like it's the night before a siege. Stan's coonhounds are on edge and Guderian's no better, and their jumps and starts at noises I can't hear make me uneasy. The storm rolls on outside, and the woods are more foreboding than ever. Swollen branches and unnaturally dark, heavy leaves seem to twitch like limbs in the shadow beneath the canopy, and their depths are alive with the sounds of motion. The ivy I planted along the fence all those weeks ago has devoured it at a pace which is nothing short of unnatural, and the forest sprawls forth like a malicious weed to meet it at the edge of the yard. Groans and ululating brays reach my ears all through the dusk-dark afternoons now, and the drums in the valley last most of the night. The shroud of waterlogged foliage leaves me nearly blind up here, and my imagination paints dreadful pictures of what must even now be going on past the woodline. For me, it's back to waiting. May 1st, 2021. I did my best to keep busy during the brightest part of the stormy day. I cut back some tangled brush that's encroaching on the yard and grabbed a weed eater from the outbuilding so I'd have it close to hand each morning to maintain the tree line. I took some tarp and shored up the roof of the chicken coop, which has been leaking in a few places. I never stay too long in one place, though, and I stay alert every moment I'm outside. I keep myself armed, but it's difficult to force myself to stay near the trees when I feel so watched each moment I'm out in the open. The garden is exploding with growth, but I feel uneasy about it. I look at it with the same cautious eyes I see the ever-deepening forest with. I desperately hope I don't have to risk eating from those plants in the future. They seem corrupt, for lack of any better word. My cell service seems to finally be failing me. It's been spotty the past few days, but I haven't had so much as a minute of it all through last night and this morning. The satellite is still on and off, but there's something going on with the audio. Something which isn't quite like the normal distortion you'd get trying to watch television with a shitty reception. There's a sort of garbled half-grunting that seeps in beneath the sound of whatever shows on screen. Never intelligible, but somehow I think that's just because I don't understand what's being said. It has the cadence of spoken words, even if they are alien to my ears. Whether that's an accurate assessment or not, the noises make me uncomfortable, so I'm avoiding the TV. I thought about heading over to check on Cody this afternoon, but the days are growing so dark that I didn't want to risk the road. It's not a long drive, and I'd be in my car, but something held me back. I'm in fight or flight mode at all hours now, because there's nowhere to run, and I'm unsure there's any way to actually fight. Regardless, I hope Cody's doing well up there. His property is a bit more open than mine, so the shadow of the forest hopefully doesn't weigh quite so heavy on him. May 3rd, 2021. Yesterday was quiet, as far as things can be said to be quiet now. The chickens are getting more and more restless, and the plants look more and more grotesque despite, or perhaps because of, their size. But there's little I can do about that. The power went out just before sundown last night, and I don't think it'll be back anytime soon. I've got candles inside and wood stocked for the stove. That's all I can hope for under the circumstances. It's a strange thing, but my phone must have latched on to a bit of reception sometime this morning while I slept. Around 10 a.m., a whole host of messages rolled in, I suppose sent over the past couple days. There were a number of missed call notifications from my parents, a slew of messages urging me to contact relatives and tell them I was all right. I suppose the world beyond the storm is beginning to become truly concerned about it. There's no way to know just how much they know, but they seem to think it's dangerous, at least. My brother sent a series of texts telling me he and his family were headed further west to stay in Indianapolis. Apparently many people were fleeing. He referenced some event in Lexington spilling over into surrounding counties. Something bigger than the so-called riot which swept the area before. Many people were dead. I couldn't respond by the time I woke just after noon. The reception had lapsed again. I'll have to make an effort to stay alert, even when I finally get to sleep in the mornings. I have the dogs to wake me up if something's amiss outside, but I don't want to miss another window of communication and give up a chance to speak with someone. Anyone. I'd like to let people know I'm all right, but that's only part of it. I want to know what's going on out there, what it looks like at the edge of the storm. In here, so close to the epicenter of things, I can't help but think things are deceptively quiet. Perhaps the dreamer is distracted, reaching outward to halt a world only just beginning to awaken to the threat beneath them. I'm still waiting on word from Stan or Van Horn as well, though at this rate they'll probably need to show up in person to actually reach me, and I'm becoming less and less certain that's even a possibility. The storm seems to be worsening here, and the noises of flights overhead have ceased. I suppose because the winds are too violent. The deafening thunder is never ending, and the days are so dark they might as well be nights. The drums haven't ceased since yesterday, and the trees are alive with motion which does not always heed the driving wind. Occasionally I feel tremors, as if elephantine feet are striking the ground not far off. There's been strange dreams, too, these past few days. I've had my fair share of paranoid nightmares and strange daydreams since all this started, but these are different. They don't feel real so much as they feel remembered. Like my groggy, waking mind is retrieving images from the day prior I just hadn't noticed at the time. There's a hazy vagueness to them, yes, but it's the sort of foggy forgetfulness that comes with drunken rambles or childhood memories, rather than the half-formed pictures of a passing dream. In these dreams, I am lying in bed, unable to move, as with sleep paralysis, I suppose, but everything seems silent. The bedroom around me is normal, with the gray light of the stormy dawn pouring in through the thin plastic of the blinds, but the storm itself makes no noise. Guderian is in the dreams, I think, seated at the end of the bed as always, but he too is silent. Only after a time do I notice that there's a strange shape in the window, obscured by the blinds. A silhouette, nothing more. Guderian sees it too, staring it down the way he eyes raw meat when I chop it at the counter. As I strain my eyes to look, I make out horns, broad and impressive. A buck's head, I think, poised as if to look in through the glass. I watch for a while, expectant, but I couldn't tell you why. Nothing happens, and I always awake to find the same old storm battering the tin roof. The silence and the fact that this dream Guderian isn't howling with fury at the approach of another animal tells me these visions can't be real. Another symptom of the monotony and the stress, I guess. Guderian himself seems calmer, at least. Maybe he's acclimating to all the noise. I can't say the same about Stan's coonhounds, but they've never been wholly at home over here without Stan to calm them down. Hopefully, he'll get back safe. And with good news. May 4th, 2021. I noticed something odd when I went out to grab some rainwater I've been collecting in the buckets near the fence line. The water looks oily, like thick, pitch-dark paint or ink has crept into it. At first, I thought some animal had contaminated it, but all the buckets were like that. By the time I got inside, I realized the rain had been streaking my skin black. It wasn't to do with the buckets at all. I'm running the water through a cloth filter, as well as the normal filter, then boiling it. I still have some clean water stashed away, so it'll be a few days before I have to risk drinking the stuff, but at least it looks and smells clean after purification. It's starting to give off a chemical scent out there. Uncomfortably close to the stink from Cody's cellar, actually. Things inside are only a little less chaotic. Guderian's been snapping at Stan's dogs this afternoon. They've fought over food before, but I've kept them separated when I feed them to prevent anything like that. Now it's just a regular occurrence. The coonhounds have started to keep the little bedroom-turned-study across the trailer from my room, and I'll shift things around in there to accommodate them away from Guderian. I don't need any dogfights on my hands. May 5th, 2021. I almost thought I heard tapping on the sliding glass door that leads out back late this morning. I hopped out of bed to see, but there wasn't anything there. Guderian was perched on the sofa in the main room, stone silent, so I suppose I just imagined it. Either that or the storm threw a branch or something up against the pane. Anything else and Guderian would have lost his shit. It could have just been loud noise rattling the glass, too. There's been a few loud crashes and thumps from way down in the valley as of late, mostly at night. Falling trees or boulders along the slopes, probably. Well, I hope. May 6th, 2021. I went out to cut back some of the plant growth eating up the fence today after the boredom of sitting in the dark house got the better of me. Much as I fear the woods, I can't stand to sit inside stewing in my own thoughts too much longer. not with the lack of news weighing heavy on me and Guderian growling at the study door every few minutes to spook the hounds. I dragged him out with me, and he seemed more spry than usual out here. It's been some time since I've seen him gallop around the fenced-in yard without eyeing the woodline all the while. It was a good distraction, kept my mind clear of dark places for an hour or so. I only crashed back to earth when I returned to the house and saw the matted-down patch of grass beneath my bedroom window. I don't know what to make of that, given the dreams I've been having. I thought about going back into the ever-thickening woods and checking my game cameras, but I can't bring myself to go, not even armed. Much as I might feel a prisoner in the trailer sometimes, the woods beyond have become just as dark and lively as the tempest that roars overhead. If there is actually a buck sitting in the yard each morning while I sleep, I suppose there's worse fates. After hearing the stories from Quirk, I'll continue to take precautions and keep guns close at hand. Still, how could a buck explain the silence? To add to our troubles, the chicken's eggs have been tainted somehow. The batch I brought in this morning are streaked with stinking, inky black oil, just like the rain. I have enough food to last a couple months with or without the eggs, but this doesn't bode well for the long term, or for the crops. I'd hate to think what the bloated beans or tomatoes in the raised beds look like on the inside. There's too much to worry about. The dogs, Stan's absence, my faraway family. I doubt I'll rest well tomorrow. May 7th, 2021. I've had to tap into the rainwater I've been collecting, but fortunately it doesn't taste odd. The scent seems to be driven off by all the prep work I'm doing, which is a bit of cautious good news. God knows I need good news. There's something off about the daylight, I think. It's dark and the storm drowns the sky in swirling clouds, but there's something else, something cold. I don't know if I can put it into words. There's this sort of fulfilled, pleasant feeling you get when you're beneath sunlight, whether muffled or not. I haven't felt that in days. I've tried to blame the onslaught of emotions all this is dredging up in me, but I can't shake the feeling that the daylight isn't just different because it's overcast. There's something more to it than that. May 9th, 2021. I've been trying to hold off making these recordings to conserve charge on the phone, but something's happened. I finally got up the nerve to push back through the tree line to the outbuilding to gather a bit of firewood I stored away in there. Guderian came in with me, the first time he's willingly gone into the woods in a while. After I'd grabbed what I could carry, I pushed out the door to see a figure bobbing through the trees downhill, passing along the now overgrown running path I'd cut towards the flooded valley down below. I called out, expecting Guderian to bark and charge off, but he didn't budge. The figure turned, and from a distance I recognized that it was Cody. I don't think he recognized me. He stared for a long moment, barely visible through the leaves, and was almost about to continue on his way when I asked what he was doing. He seemed to mull that over a minute, like I'd asked something he hadn't thought to consider. Then he said, "I'm going to meet him." I was struck dumb by how similar the vacant eyes and fumbling delivery were to Kotkin's all those months ago, when I'd stopped him on my driveway. By the time I called out after him, he'd trotted off downhill and out of view into the deepest, most overgrown span of the forest. The drums still beat their ceaseless rhythm down there in the shadows beneath the canopy, and the branches seemed to sway and buckle even near the ground, where the wind can't reach. I didn't dare follow him. Not down there. I made myself drive up the muddy, worn road to his place just an hour or so later. I told myself it was to check on him, to go through the motions of looking out for him without setting foot in the valley. It was more out of curiosity, though. I guess I wanted to see what he'd been doing, how his days held hostage by the land around him had been spent, and how he'd come to walk head first into the deepest depths of the hostile forest. He'd left his door standing open. The interior was normal, if a bit unkempt. I couldn't bring myself to check the cellar, but there wasn't any awful, unnameable odor about the place. At least, not beyond the odor which had crept into the rain outside. What I did find was a scrawled note to a family member, as far as I could tell, though the writing was so haphazard I couldn't make out the name at all. My voyeur's hunger was strong enough that I read it then and there, in the bowels of that creaking old house with the wind howling against the walls. It was only half legible, and the flow seemed scattered and disjointed, like he'd abandoned it only to return and add more over the course of a few days. In the note, he said he'd been miserable for a long time, but that the thing which slept beneath the mountains was going to change all that. There were references to conversations he'd had with someone, he who minds the trees, as Cody put it, about a new age of which he could be a part. He had a purpose again, he said, for the first time in a long time. I gathered my wits and left when a particularly vicious thunderclap knocked loose the door to the cellar and scared me half to death. I felt watched all the way back to the trailer, but that's par for the course these days. I haven't had the time to dwell on what all that meant, though. I was in for a much fouler surprise back home. I pushed through my front door, only to find the interior bloodied and battered. Stools had been knocked over, furniture had been pushed askew, and the metallic stink of blood filled the air. Guderian has killed both Stan's coonhounds. I don't know how they got into the main stretch of the house, or how Guderian got in, but I found one dead in the study and the other curled up in the small laundry room. Their throats had been torn, and their bodies savaged. It was horrendous. I've been cleaning all through the evening, trying to get the scent of blood out of my nose. Guderian didn't even seem fazed. If anything, he was happy to see me, tail wagging playfully as he shook the caked blood from his coat. I don't know how to react to this. I've laid Stan's poor dogs out back in the forest. I can't take the time to bury them, not with those drums rumbling in the trees. I feel like I should be on edge, like I should be afraid to share the house with Guderian, but he seems so normal. I thought about pinning him up in the outbuilding, but I couldn't do that to him. He's a truer companion than any human being could ever be. Even if he'd grown aggressive, and I felt he'd do me harm, I'd put him down mercifully before I locked him up beneath the trees out there, where the deer gather for their nightly vigils and the trees bend unnaturally in the inky night. I've cleaned him up as best I can and made him comfortable. He only has a few gashes along his leg, and they don't seem to bother him. I've resolved not to tell Stan, if he gets back at all, something which seems less likely by the day. For the foreseeable future, it's just me and Guderian. May 10th, 2021. I had another of the dreams last night. It began the same. The deer at the window, Guderian attentive, the world silent. Then someone spoke. I don't know who. I woke up just as the voice sounded. I feel like it came from the window, though I didn't see the deer or whatever move out there. It had an odd, off-putting cadence, a sort of guttural electric buzzing, like poorly recorded words played on shitty old speakers. It said my name. May 15th, 2021. The drumming in the valley never stops. It gets louder by the day. The braying and the roaring are getting deeper, more frenzied, as if whatever's making the noise is running out of time, gnawing at the damp air of the forest to make itself known. The thunder seems to mimic the ebb and flow of the music. It rises and falls in great shuddering cracks, but never does the flash of lightning accompany all that awful noise. The pallid light behind the clouds is no more comforting at the height of day than the onyx dark of the stormy night sky, and the clocks on phones and watches that survived the power outage have lost any bearing on reality. Some tick by minutes as if they were seconds, while others haven't budged in several nights. I etch a tally of days on the wall by my bed to keep myself grounded, a desperate attempt to leave a tangible mark for each clamorous night that passes by outside. But who could tell whether it's accurate? My sleep is becoming less certain. Have I slept in the past few days? Impossible to say. The boundary between waking and resting is blurred as the boundary between night and day. I must sleep, though, for in the darkest hours of my nervous vigil in the house, the horned silhouette returns to my bedroom window, and I hear it speak in that half-screeching artificial whisper. It tells me wretched things, things which cannot be. It says that the edges of the storm have reached the east coast of the continent now, spilling out over the ocean even as they continue their slow crawl across the plains out west. Last night, it matter-of-factly informed me that Chicago had been eaten. These were the words it used, and that the dreamer was pleased with its meal. The most troubling words are those about the dreamer itself, about its aims, its vision, if such words can be applied to it. The silhouette tells me of the new, raucous life, which has taken root in the ruins of cities whose names it rattles off like classifications for hated pests. The dreamer, it says, has breathed new energy into these stagnant hives. Where meek people once measured their worth by the material comforts with which they surrounded themselves, now the strength to defend one's life was the only measure of worth. Wealth had no meaning. One now took what was needed by force, or was crushed in the attempt. The urban decadence of these glitzy testaments to sedentary, gluttonous existence had been torn down and reborn, and now served as the grazing grounds for the dreamer's young. The dreamer's forests would devour them in time, just as the dreamer's offspring had devoured their inhabitants. These words are most troubling because I feel weight behind their brutality. Hadn't I run from the rootless cosmopolitan existence of the city because of the aimless, vapid decadence of it all? Had I not been disgusted? If the aim of a man working 50 hours a week sitting down in a cloistered room is merely to make enough so that he might ride home at night in the newest model of his favorite car, can he be said to have any aim at all? These were questions I had asked myself, but never had the words. No, the bravery to express. The silhouette in my dreams speaks those words and more. It tells of struggle, real existential struggle, rather than the soft, malleable struggle of being unsatisfied with your social station or taking offense at the manners of a neighbor. The men of the world beyond the storm dreamed of comfort, of happiness, but the dreamer dreamt only of strength. The dreamers spawn fight and revel and slaughter not because they must, but because they love it. The meager heroes of the mundane world beyond these clouds are protectors and providers, but the heroes of the new world will count only conquerors among their ranks. I understand the silhouette's ramblings more than I wish to admit. Still, I can't believe it's tangible. The silhouette speaks long and slow. Time, already so malleable, is hard to measure. I always find myself in bed afterwards. I refuse to believe the whispers are real. Why would my little trailer on the hill still stand if there were things ravaging the continent at the edges of this storm? Guderian has been oddly silent. Not tense or frenzied, mind you, as in the early days of the storm, but totally at peace. He simply looks out the back door and waits. May 17th, 2021. More dreams, more talk of the dreamer's children at the edge of the storm. It's hard to keep alert now, even though I stay sedentary most of the day. I don't feel rested, nor do I feel refreshed when I wake up in a sweat from sleep with the weighty words of that horned figure ringing in my head. I heard the chickens making a fuss after waking up today, and I rushed out into the rain to find they'd flown the coop. Something broke the back wall and tore open the fence against the woods. There was no bloody aftermath, though. No frayed feathers or shattered bodies. I feel like they were let loose, not killed. Though why I've come to think that, I can't say. May 18th, 2021. I ran outside after waking from the dreams this morning, or whatever time it was. I want to know what's out there, if there's something out there. I found nothing. Nothing, that is, save the familiar matted and torn grass beneath the window. I feel as if I glimpsed something overhead as I went in, though. The clouds broke far out across the valley, above the dark outline of the distant hills. What lay beyond was a pallid, sickly white, almost fluorescent, free of color, and alive with an unearthly light which was anything but warm. May 19th, 2021. There are things moving amidst the trees, many more than usual. Some are small, chittering as they scour the underbrush, and others thud like giants amongst snapping trees. The woods are too thick now to see much, but I can hear them dancing and sprinting from trunk to trunk, cracking branches and thumping over the muddy soil. The chanting is louder now. It comes in the dreams as well as during the day. Somehow they alleviate the icy silence. The dreams feel less uncanny when the strange silhouette's twisted voice isn't the sole sound in the world. May 22nd, 2021. My last dream was oddly vivid. For the first time, I was able to speak. I asked questions, and the silhouette beyond the window furnished answers. I asked about many things which bothered me. I wondered what the end goal of the dreamer was. How powerful was it? Surely once things got to a certain point, countless peoples would rise up against it. Even if civilization was fat and opulent, unused to the rigors of survival under harsh conditions, it still had terrible weapons at its disposal. The same techniques which had fattened and enfeebled mankind had gifted it the ability to split the atom. Did the dreamer truly have a chance against them? The silhouette had retorts for all these things, and none were in favor of the people beyond the storm. Often these answers came as countering questions like, what hope does mankind, with all its techniques, have of halting the rising of the sun? We traded words long into the day. At last, when I felt, for reasons I can't fully give voice to, that our time was growing short, I asked why I was to be spared. Why were the dancing things behind the trees held at bay, braying their fury into the rain just beyond my gaze? What was to become of me? I had a design, I was told. The dreamer had many such designs. What, then, was mine? The silhouette seemed to nod from its perch on the other side of the window. I don't know how, but I know he was motioning to Guderian, still and content at the foot of the bed. You will do as he has done, came the reply. May 23rd, 2021. The rain is breaking, I think. It slowed to a drizzle before daybreak. I can see the pale light of the sky behind the clouds more clearly now. It is cold, distant. but not altogether unpleasant. The plants seem to almost bend upwards to catch its rays after their long stint in the dark. I feel like they've taken on an odd hue. A sort of reddish tinge has crept into the verdant leaves. The drums are still here, but the rhythm is shifting. Celebration, I think. Exaltation at some distant victory beyond the stormy horizon. I feel it more than hear it, for the silhouette will not tell me what it is they celebrate, but I know it all the same. The dreamer is another step closer to waking, another inch nearer to dragging the dream into reality. May 25th, 2021. The silhouette urged me to take a walk amongst the trees this morning, and I obliged. The storm has broken, here at least, and the bloated woods are silent as they drink deep the cool light of the new sky. The dreamer's sun is a window into his own mind, the silhouette says. I can see what's meant by that. The whole of the daytime sky seems bleached like aged bone, and the great blackened hole which writhes and flickers where the sun once was draws the eye. I find myself staring at it often, watching its subtle motions, the reflections which play themselves out deep within. Many tiny, mirror-like obsidian stars decorate the canvas, writhe their own dances alongside it. These reflect the distant siblings of the dreamer, I'm told, his countless brothers and sisters on far-flung worlds, waiting to wake when their own times should come. The forest has taken on his countenance. Black veins feed the crimson leaves of trees whose bark has gone pale and cold. Shadows cast by the gleaming sky above the interwoven canopy are deeper than normal, dark and alive with whispering things which flit from branch to branch. I don't feel stalked back there anymore, though, only watched over. I went in unarmed, and Guderian followed unleashed. A more placid jaunt through the valley I've never had. We were turned back not far from the creeks, though. A voice rang up from the boulders on the slopes, the familiar piping tones of the silhouette, and told us we had seen enough for one day. I didn't argue. I am content. We all are. May 29th, 2021. Our friend asked us to come out and see him today. For the first time, I could not deny that I was awake. I rolled out of bed, slipped on my boots, and trod out into the cool light of a windless morning with Guderian at my side. He was no silhouette, that friend of ours. Indeed, he wasn't a deer, though his head certainly held the shape of one. A great tendril of furred flesh wove its way up out of the woods and across the yard to the window, alive with motion. Here and there, hoofed limbs wriggled and writhed, like those of a millipede, many-jointed and lithe. There were other heads along its length, some goatish, some almost human. But it was the large, horned buck's head which led the chorus when it told me, at long last, of the dreamer's design. I'm disgusted to say that only a month ago I might have been revolted by the sight. But there, in the light of the new dawn, I felt nothing but awe. This was the dreamer, or perhaps more accurately, one of his many limbs extended to guide me in my hour of need. He had slid up from below the stone in the valley night after night to whisper to us, and at last I'd had the fortitude to hear him. Stan is coming back. More accurately, the remnants of the call of the mountain are coming back, and Stan is among them. The dreamer's children in the woodland have seen this from afar, but they have kept their claws sheathed, biding their time. The dreamer enjoys games, and this is no exception. The dreamer flatters me with a chance at joining him, just as Guderian has done. Should I offer up struggle in his name and prove myself the stronger? I will be free to caper alongside the dreamer's adopted spawn in the trees. I will be permitted to seek the edge of the storm as it pours outward across the face of the world, and find there the purpose and camaraderie which can only be born of conquest. I will have forged my place in a war host which knows no fear, no hunger, no pain. He locked eyes with me then, the enlarged black orbs in his primary skull seeming to bore into me, and in them I read a mythology which I know down to my bones to be real. I saw the dreamer fall in a cradle of black stone to the earth in ages long past, to land in the desert of a far-off country. I saw his first disciples drawn to him where he lay in the arid mountains of this distant land, their dreams telling them where they might wander, drawing them like moths to an open flame. I saw them cast off their nomadic traditions, that they might make offerings in the dreamer's name. I saw these first faithful spill out of their highland strongholds to terrorize the men of Mesopotamia, who had grown fat on grain and wealth. These heady days were not to last. I saw how the dreamer's worshippers were cast out of the old world thousands of years ago and forced onto the sea. I saw how these outcasts prayed and pleaded, and how their distant, sleeping god steered them westward towards undiscovered shores. I saw these strange worshippers bury their idols in the Appalachian hills of the New World, and erect the dark totems beneath which they made offerings to their master down below. I saw their annihilation war with the natives, who could see only debauchery and their blood rites practiced in the shadow of the mountains. Then I felt the long silence which followed through the dreamer's eyes. I lived out millennia in mere moments, each minute black, cold, silent. In those thousands of lonely years, I had only thoughts of home to comfort me. My imagination was one with the dreamers, and in that lightless span of years, I walked these sunless savannas and crimson jungles of its home beyond the stars. I recalled a beauty through him which I had never seen, and came back to my senses in the backyard a changed man. Perhaps I have seen it. I see it reflected in the black sun overhead, and the dark scarlet which has crept into the leaves. I see it in the gnarled black things which scamper and bound gracefully from tree to tree. I smell it in the rich, oily ichor which is seeped up into the water, and which falls with each tender rain. The blood of the dreamer has made all this possible. So too will it make my ascension as his child possible, if only I can do as he has asked. That is precisely what I aim to do. Guderian and I are lying in wait, our eyes ever trained on the overgrown road. The dreamer's enemies are desperate. They believe a last march into the heart of his forest might stop him. They are wrong. The woods are alive now, not with the weak, fragile life of the earth as it was before his awakening, but with a new, vibrant life. This chittering, hungry legion will not let these enemies pass unscathed, even if I fail to stop them. Their intervention will not be necessary, however. I swear this in the dreamer's clouded name. I will meet the call of the mountain with cunning and guile. They will not know who I serve until it is far too late. I will strike them with surety and strength. Only such raw and boundless traits as these can bring the dreamer comfort. Only then, when I have supped on them in the shadows of the trees, will I finally belong. Only then